Now, as you may have heard on Arise News, Pope Francis has released an apostolic exhortation, a form of communication to the Church in which he's criticised politicians and called for greater holiness. The exhortation is a guide for moral purity and represents the Pope's view on personal holiness. In around 103 pages, the Pontiff invites all Christians to set aside the goal of material prosperity and criticises clerics and clergy for seeking advancement. He also urges Roman Catholics to avoid downplaying the situation faced by migrants. He said it was understandable that politicians looking for votes might do this, but not, in his words, for Christians to do so. Correspondents say the remarks appear to be a challenge or challenge the position of prominent politicians such as the US President Donald Trump and the newly re-elected Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, who campaigned on an anti-immigrant platform. Well, for more of the Pope's strongly worded exhortation, I'm joined now live from our studios in London by Caroline Farrow, columnist for the UK Catholic Press. And good to see you there, Caroline. Of course, the apostolic exhortation differs from an encyclical because it does not define doctrine, but represents the Pope's view of personal holiness. Nevertheless, it is an important teaching pronouncement, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, so we have to remember that this exhortation doesn't carry any sort of doctrinal weight, but we should always listen to what the Pope has to say to us and take note of it. But as you say, it isn't formal Catholic teaching. It's the Pope encouraging us to holiness.
So, of course, Pope Francis, according to that exhortation, wants Christians to focus on true acts of holiness. I mean, what are these true acts of holiness?
Well, he's really rather lovely and rather encouraging in this because he draws on the spirituality of the Opus Dei movement and St. Jose Maria Escriva, and he says that holiness is found in the everyday things. So in a mum caring for her children, maybe a husband working hard, earning money, in the sick, in the disabled. And he said, it can be something as simple as going shopping, meeting a neighbour, the neighbour starts to gossip, and you refrain from gossip. You realise that this isn't a holy thing to do, and you move away from that. So he's talking about finding a holiness in the everyday things that we do, rather than necessarily enormous acts of charity, which are important, but it's finding the holiness in the everyday and offering that to God. So it really was quite a lovely little reflection, and I think one that many Catholics appreciated.
He also draws particular attention to the treatment of migrants, where he says that the issue of migrants is often regarded as secondary, and he says that a politician might say such a thing, but not a Christian, from whom the proper attitude is to stand in the shoes of those brothers and sisters who risk their lives to offer a future to their children. And I'm quoting him now. And this is something that has defined the pontificate of the Pope: advocacy on behalf of migrants, the poor, the so-called rootless. I mean, he's very much a defender of those individuals, isn't he?
Absolutely, and he has been for the whole of his papacy. So last year he talked about how the rights of migrants needs to come before the rights of national security. Just at the Easter Vigil a couple of weeks ago, he baptised a Nigerian migrant who had committed an act of heroism, who disarmed a thief in a robbery. And he's always speaking out in favour of migrants and how Christians must welcome migrants. But then again, this is not a new kind of Catholic idea. St. John Paul II set up a specific Vatican department in 1988, the Pontifical Academy for migrants and itinerants. So, although, yes, Pope Francis is focusing on migrants, this isn't a new thing. And I think as well, it ought to be emphasised that most Catholics, I think, particularly in the UK, where I'm speaking from, we do tend to highlight the importance of these issues of migration, refugees, immigrants, the poor, the homeless. And I think you know, the Pope was perhaps referring maybe to other parts of the world and saying, you know, we must make sure as Catholics and as Christians that we do prioritise migrants. But I think, you know, most Catholics do already. It shouldn't be, because the other thing that he mentioned, which I think has caused some contention, is that he talked about the unborn, and he said, you know, you shouldn't prioritise one after the other. Now, a lot of Catholics do a lot of pro-life work, and, you know, it mustn't be thought that by doing pro-life work that you're saying that, you know, the unborn are more important than the migrants. But obviously there is the fact that some people have to prioritise their time, and so, you know, Catholics do traditionally speak out for the unborn and are known with that issue, and that's fine, but we mustn't at the same time neglect the immigrants, migrants, refugees, the poor, homeless, prisoners, you know, all those who are dispossessed.
Absolutely. And there are, of course, the conservative critics who argue that the Pope's extraordinary focus on social issues like caring for migrants has led him to lose sight of the true doctrine. There are even those who say he's leading the faithful astray, especially when in a previous exhortation he appeared to endorse a move for divorced and remarried Catholics to receive Holy Communion, a possibility which some have called heretical. I mean, is this idea of some sort of ideological error on the part of the pontiff a popular view within the Catholic faith?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think you have to remember that there are 1 billion Catholics spread throughout the world. But actually, those critics of the Pope, they aren't criticising him for his support for migrants. Actually, the reason that they're criticising him is because the Pope's style is very much the vernacular, he's very colloquial, and it doesn't always lend itself well to the written format. And some of the things that the Pope has said have been, or could be interpreted as being quite ambiguous. And that stands in stark contrast to, say, the previous Pope, Benedict XVI, whose writing had, you know, was very, very clear, that had deep clarity to it. And in his last exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, as you mentioned, the Pope did, in a footnote, leave open the potential possibility for communion to be given to the divorced and remarried. And it is this issue that is causing Conservatives' consternation, because obviously if this were to be sort of changed, then this means that this is a changing of Catholic doctrine, and it is sort of, it would be a rupture really with what Jesus taught in the scriptures, and what the Conservatives are wanting is clarity on this issue of communion for the divorced and remarried. So they're not attacking the Pope for his stance on migrants, but they are saying we need some clarity on this other really pressing doctrinal issue. You know, it's not an either or, you know, and John Paul II, as I said, was very conservative. He really did speak out in favour of migrants too, and nobody had a problem with that.
Caroline, that's really very enlightening and very interesting. Caroline Farrow, the columnist for the UK Catholic Press, speaking to us live there from our studios in London. Thank you very much indeed.